All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby. I'm from the Adjudication Core. As part of the tradition and NUDC and each of the preliminary rounds, the Adjudication Core is going to release a PDA, which is a post-debate analysis for the motions. This is intended to share with you some of the insights and some of the ideas that we thought about when we were making the motion, so that teams can, have a better understanding of the topic itself, what are the possible arguments or framing or setup that you could have run with, and things like that. So we hope that the purposes of this post-debate analysis would be educational in nature for you, so that you can improve yourselves in the next round. All right, so let's get on to it. So the motion for round one is this House regrets the glorification of motherhood. Now there are three key areas of questions in the debate. The first is what's happening in status quo with regards to motherhood. The second is what are the impacts of glorification itself? And finally, given that this is a regrets motion, so it's not just a motion where you oppose something, but you regret. And when you regret, there's a sense of evaluation, right? So you have to provide a counterfactual. So the third area question here is that in a world where glorification does not exist, what's going to happen? Is it going to be a better world or is it going to be a worse world? And that is an important part of the debate that must be integrated. So let's move on to the first area question, which is about what's happening in status quo with regards to motherhood. So let's take a look at the government case first. So firstly, it's important for the government team to define what motherhood is and how is it being treated currently. So on the government team, you obviously, because you regret it, you want to say that, motherhood is being portrayed as something that's problematic. So firstly, you want to say that motherhood is treated as an achievement, as an important milestone that women must experience in their lives. Now, the way that it's being portrayed is that it's depicted as a rite of passage that defines a woman's life, that they would only be happier if they have children, and that it's a rewarding experience, it's going to fulfill their lives, it's basically going to make them happy. Now, the problem with that narrative is that it creates this understanding in society that in order for your life to have meaning, women must pursue marriage and that women must have children. And otherwise, your inability to fulfill that social expectation would mean that your lives are incomplete. And this is what happens in status quo, is that when, women, especially young women who are already graduated from university, they have like a good job, a stable life. But the question that they keep getting, for example, during holidays, during family gatherings, is that when are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? So it's as if that it invalidates any other forms of experiences that women have, and that being a mother should be the most important thing that defines your life. So the problem with that narrative is that it creates a lot of pressure in society that, women, you should not prioritize your professional lives too much. That's why in Indonesia, for example, there is this saying that what's the purpose of sending women to higher education for them to get their master's degree or sending them for like their PhD if at the end of the day their role is supposed to be a mother, to be a homemaker, staying at home, looking after their family and looking after their children. Because if they don't do that, then they are wasting their biological clock that is slowly ticking away. Now, the harms of that is that it harms women's agency in making decision for themselves, basically making her as a subject of societal oppression. So this is the approach that government team could run when it comes to the identification of the status quo with regards to motherhood. Now let's compare that with the opposition. What can opposition actually say in this debate? So there are a couple of things. The first thing is that opposition can recharacterize by saying that, you know what, motherhood is actually something that is looked down upon in the status quo. That, given we have feminism being on the rise, women's rights organizations being very active in their activism for women's rights and equality, women are currently able to access many things that was previously unavailable for them. But this comes at a cost where, the trend is that anything that is associated with the past, the traditional conception of a womanhood or the identity of being a woman, it's heavily discouraged and even looked down upon. And this is something that motherhood gets a stigma on, is that it's being seen as you are a product of the past. Like being a mother is just so outdated. It's like the 50s and the 60s of it all. And that's why a lot of the current feminism sort of condemns women for being mothers in that regard. And so because motherhood is being degraded, where again, feminists claim that women are actually being subservient to patriarchal structures and setting back women's progress for years, all of this creates a disincentive for women to become mothers because they fear that there's going to be label, that there's going to be new stigma imposed upon them as being this outdated woman. And that is why it's problematic if we don't have, the glorification when it comes to motherhood, is that it creates that imbalance. So this is the first key discussion when it comes to the motion. Now let's take a look at the second key question, which is about what are the impacts of glorification? So, on the government team, obviously, one of the most important things that you need to do is define how does glorification happen in society. Now, there are a couple of things. The first is that society, commemorates certain days like Mother's Days or even like Hari Kartini as a celebration of being a traditional woman or being an Ibu. We also see like popular culture portraying the wondrous joys of being a mother. You see many movies that are very emotional that talks about a woman like raising her child, like that movie for example in The Blind Side with Sandra Bullock, where she adopted an African American child and then she tries to make sure that he gets into professional football. You see this in like mainstream coverage of people like Angelina Jolie, who adopts many kids from many different countries as a definition of them, feeling happy about themselves. And you also have like corporations that capitalize as products targeted to young mothers. Now, we need to talk about then the impact, right? So on the government team, you can talk about two harms of glorification. So the first is that it creates an expectation of women that they're being defined by their supposed biological duties. And this only entrenches the sexism that has been in society for so long. One of the things that feminism tries to advocate for is that women are not being defined by their assigned sex at birth. So just because they have the reproductive organs doesn't necessarily mean that that's their inherent function, and that should be the sort of like dominant conception of what they should be. And that is what feminism has been trying to fight for so long, because many people say that a man's place is within the public sphere, whereas a woman should remain in the domestic private sphere. These are the things that we're trying to combat, and having glorification of motherhood only instills that narrative that women belong in the domestic sphere and that is their supposed role. And the problem with that is that then this causes women to constantly have to choose between prioritizing family or prioritizing her career or her other personal life choices. And we think that's a problematic dichotomy because men are not subject to that very same sort of like dilemma that women are being imposed to. And we think that is a problem when you have glorification of motherhood. Now, the second harm is that because glorification is about telling all of the positive things about being a mother, it creates a very, very problematic illusion that, being a mother is all rainbows and sunshine, it's all happiness and joy. So it's like a walk in the park, but it's really not. There is a saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and there's no lie in that because it's a massively difficult task to do. When when you don't prepare women enough for that role, this causes many young mothers to experience mental breakdowns because they find the task of raising a child extremely challenging. And so that's why the glorification of motherhood actually does a disservice because it sort of like manipulates women in saying, hey, it's all fun and joy. But then the moment when things get rough, basically they're just saying you have to suck it up because it has to be fun, it has to be joyous, whereas that is not the reality. So those are the cases that you can bring from the government perspective. Now let's take a look at the opposition. So given that the society's trend is moving closer in antagonizing mothers, it's important for us to tell women that being a mother is still a valid choice for you to take, because the point of glorification is that you want to act as a counterbalance towards the current trends, because the current trend is that women needs to, pursue jobs like being a businesswoman or being a politician and things like that. So it's important for us to paint motherhood as something that women can get benefits from. Now, there are two important benefits from glorification. The first is that it helps women to ease into the role, because glorification, it portrays that when you raise your child, of course you will face challenges, but knowing that you had a hand in shaping someone's life, to become a better person, is definitely a rewarding outcome. It gives you a psychological comfort that you are indeed doing something meaningful, that you are creating an impact on somebody's life, that is not all useless. And it's important for people to understand that, because not all benefits have to be like tangible in the sense that you get material benefit, that you make money out of it. It can also be in the abstract form. And so that's why it's critical for us to remind women that these benefits do exist. The second part is that it also shows solidarity, that it tells women you are not alone in wanting to be a mother. Because in a world where women are expected to become CEOs, to become politicians, to be incredibly successful, the road to motherhood seems like a very lonely path. And when women feel that that decision is, there's no one else going through it, they are difficult to find support groups, other people who are experiencing, the same situation. Now, it's critical to remind women that others are going through this too. And so that's why um, that is the benefit of glorification. All right, so those are the cases for the second question. Now moving on to the third part, which is in a world where glorification does not exist, what happens then? So let's talk about the government case first. Remember that because it's a regret motion, we have to provide a comparative to the counterfactual. So firstly, in absence of glorification, we can have honest conversations about the downsides of motherhood. Because when you have glorification, it oftentimes dominates the discourse. It dominates the mainstream media. It dominates people's attention. And therefore, it's just really difficult for people to point out that motherhood has challenges, because it's going to get, dismissed by people saying that, oh, you're just a, sort of like a downer, someone who's a killjoy and things like that. So when glorification do not exist, we can have those difficult conversations. We can talk about, for example, about mothers who are experiencing the phenomenon that is known as baby blues or postpartum depression. These are things that many women are suffering the moment after they give birth to a child. They can actually feel depression, or the fact that, if you don't prepare yourself to be ready mentally, um, when you have children, it's going to have some unintended negative consequences. For example, you might inflict mental scars without knowing that you're doing it, and how that might put a strain on the children and the mother relationships and things like that. So these are some of the important benefits that we can gain when glorification is removed. Now, the ultimate conclusion of this point is that this ensures that women indeed wants to become a mother, that they entered the decision with eyes wide open of the pros and cons of doing so, rather than being given a false sense of security on what glorification actually gives them. And that is a critical distinction on the government bench. Now, let's take a look at the case for the opposition. So, in absence of glorification, what would happen is there would be a domination of other narratives, because that's just the way that narratives work, is that if you don't have one that is being glorified, some other thing will, fill in the vacuum and be glorified. So there's going to be a lot of negative narratives on motherhood, especially when radical feminists are currently very vocal in contemporary discourse. And here's the issue, right? Women are already dealing with a lot in life. They have discrimination, they have sexism, there's just so many issues. And now there's going to be additional condemnation from fellow women that they're going to be massively discouraged from pursuing motherhood. Now, this will become new pressures for women to then pursue other conceptions of meaningful life, like examples again, like being a CEO, being a politician, etc. But these things are more difficult because there's just so many structural barriers. For you to be a successful woman in business, you need to have capital. You need to have the ruthless ability to compete in such a fierce and toxic environment. These are things that are equally, if not more challenging than motherhood. So you are essentially also creating sort of like a false sense of security to people, to women specifically, towards other forms of jobs or conceptions of meaningful life. And that is problematic. Now, the conclusion of this point is that this is bad because the whole point of feminism was about getting women's agency to decide for themselves, that they can decide what they think is best. Now, when you don't have glorification, now their decisions will still be dictated just by a different coercive force. And that is not one that we think would necessarily be good. All right, so those are the potential arguments that the teams can bring for both government and opposition. We hope that this particular session was insightful for you to use in the next rounds. That is it. Thank you so much and have a good, enjoyable experience in NUDC for the next rounds.